I'm Lynn Hannings. I'm the Vice President of the Alliance International, and I'd like to welcome you to this very first Alliance information session. It's the first, but it certainly won't be the last. We'll have lots more of these because it's just an important time to learn and to better understand environmental regulations as they continue to tighten on the materials that we all use for our livelihoods. Regulations here in the US and also in Europe. We're a large group today, so I hope that if you do have questions, you'll put them in the chat, and then we can try to answer them as efficiently as possible. Today's presentation is entitled The Lacey Act, What You Need to Know. Many of us are confused or anxious when we hear the words Lacey Act mentioned, or just think that it doesn't apply to us personally. It's somebody else's problem. Our guest today is an expert in the field and will help us better understand what we need to do to be in compliance in these times of change. I'd like to introduce Ashley Amidon, Executive Director of the International Wood Products Association, who comes to us today with years of experience with the Lacey Act. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
All right, I'm going to share my screen really quickly to get my presentation set up. Can everybody see okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everybody. So as Lynn mentioned, I am with the International Wood Products Association, and I am coming to you today as part of a grant that IWPA has from the federal government. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but my job under this grant is to share as much information with as many people as possible about the Lacey Act. So I'm very excited to answer any questions you have. I will ask if everybody could just mute their microphones so that we hopefully don't have any feedback during. And I will also start off with an apology. I'm suffering from a cold, so if you see me sneezing or coughing, I will try to mute my microphone before it happens. Happy to take any questions at the end. Any that we don't get to, Lynn, feel free to send to me afterward, and I'm happy to answer them. I want to make sure that everybody gets the information they need today. So with that, the least exciting portion of my presentation, and this is the disclaimers. I promise I am not going to read all of these to you, but I do want to share a couple important elements of this slide. The first is that I am not a lawyer. I do not play one on stage or screen. So if you have specific legal questions, it's really important that you talk with a lawyer that knows your business, knows your supply chain. Nothing that you're going to see here, or indeed in any of our education that we do, constitutes legal advice. The second thing I want to mention is IWPA has been doing Lacey Act education since 2015, and that training, both when we started it in 2015 and throughout the years since, we have had a lot of information shared with us from multiple governments, agencies, industry folks, environmental groups. Nothing that you're about to see today or in any of our education online or in person constitutes an official statement from any of those bodies. So with that exciting stuff out of the way, here's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll go briefly over a little bit of Lacey Act history, talk about the 2008 amendments that brought in wood and wood products. We'll talk about what's in and what's out, discuss the declaration, talk a little bit about some of the legal cases and what they mean. We'll also discuss a little bit about what compliance looks like, what you need to know specific to 2024, and then, of course, time for questions at the end. So I'm going to start off with a very little bit of history about the Lacey Act. The Lacey Act actually begins in 1900. And if any of you, like me, love a good costume drama like The Gilded Age or Upstairs Downstairs or Downton Abbey, you might remember that around the turn of the century, women had a fashion trend that was gigantic hats and a ton of feathers, sometimes even whole birds. And while beautiful for the time, it was causing overhunting for a lot of birds with beautiful feathers. So states were passing patchwork of laws, right? So you might, in Pennsylvania, not be able to hunt certain birds, but someone could hunt those birds, take them across the state line to Virginia, to Maryland, to New York, and sell them legally. So Congress recognized that there was need for a national policy when it came to respecting state laws regarding birds. So hence we have the Lacey Act as passed. Now, there were 6 amendments between 1900 and 2008. I'm not going to go in depth on them just because they're not really relevant for what we're here to talk about. But all you need to know is that you have these amendments, you bring in things like fish, animals, and you establish both individual and corporate responsibility. Fast forward to 2008, imagine a time when Congress actually passes bipartisan legislation, and we have the Farm Bill in 2008. This is when plant and plant products are added to the Lacey Act. So I give this little bit of history not only because I'm a history buff and I find it interesting to talk about, but I also want to share because I think a lot of folks in our industry think of the Lacey Act as only being around since 2008. For the purposes of plant and plant products, that's true. But the Lacey Act as a concept, when it comes to legal precedent, when it comes to knowledge, is a lot older than that. It has been around for 124 years. So it's important to remember that as we're going in, that while it might be new for us, it's not new overall. So let's talk a little bit about that 2008 magic date. So I've already mentioned that's when plant and plant products are added. There is also a totally new element that's added to the Lacey Act at that point, and that is the idea of a declaration. I will use declaration and the official name, which is PPQ 505, sort of interchangeably throughout this. You're welcome to do so as well. They both mean the same thing. I'm not going to quote the legislative language to you from the Lacey Act because I don't think any of us need a nap right now. But really, what you need to know as of 2008, you cannot illegally take plant or plant products, right? The Lacey Act says that at no point in the chain of commerce coming into the United States can you have a plant or plant product that is illegal. Now, it's always worth pausing here, I think, to talk about what illegal means, because I think we all probably have a pretty good idea in our mind, right? You imagine someone in the dead of night sneaking into a national park or jumping a fence, right, to their neighbor's concession and stealing wood. And that's, again, obviously illegal. But the Lacey Act defines illegality much more broadly than that. It means any violation of any law in the supply chain. And as you all know, supply chains are incredibly complicated these days. They can involve dozens of countries in some cases and many, many businesses. And if at any point in that chain a law was broken, not just a US law, but a law in the country where the product is being moved through, is being taken from, is being processed in, at any point that then makes the wood illegal to own. So the Lacey Act is, again, is a very broad sense of what is illegal. So under the Lacey Act, there are two primary responsibilities. The first is the responsibility to conduct legal trade in plant and plant products, and this is for the entire supply chain. I talk to a lot of folks that say, well, I'm not the importer of record. This is not really something I need to worry about. That is absolutely not the case. Every single actor in the supply chain is required to comply with the Lacey Act. There is a separate responsibility, which is making a declaration. Now, a declaration is a form, and we'll talk a little bit about it in just a minute. This is a responsibility that is specific to the importer of record. So if you think about the Lacey Act covering all plant and plant products, right? The declaration started off as a small portion of that big circle because the declaration has been phased in. So my members, right, a lot of them are importing lumber. They were covered immediately by the declaration. But the US government has slowly expanded the declaration, ultimately with the goal of covering that whole circle, right, of all plant and plant products. But they understand that the farther you get away from a log, the harder it can be to file that declaration. So they have been phasing it in based on HTS codes. But again, these are separate responsibilities. Just because you aren't making a declaration, either you're not covered yet or you're not an importer of record, you still have to comply with the Lacey Act overall. So everyone is responsible, right? If you take nothing else away from this presentation, I hope that's not the case, but if you're just tuning in now and you want to screenshot one slide, this is the slide to screenshot. The whole supply chain matters. If it is illegal in one place, it is illegal everywhere afterward, right? even if you are not an importer of record, and I don't know how many of you on this call are, you still have to do due diligence to ensure that you are complying with the Lacey Act, because the Lacey Act is a strict liability law. And what that means is that you do not have to have personally committed a crime or even have been aware a crime was committed. You still have liability under the Lacey Act. It is a very terrifying thing, quite frankly, particularly for small businesses, but it is something that you do need to be aware of if you are dealing with plant and plant products. So, what does this mean practically for you? You have to know your supply chain, you have to know your product, and you have to know your supplier. IWPA does in-person education, 2.5 days of a course, and we have our students chant this: source, species, supplier, because these are the 3 key points that you have to be aware of if you're trading in plant and plant products. If you know where your product is coming from, if you know who is getting it to you, and if you know, where it's coming from, that's going to help you understand how to comply with the Lacey Act. So one of the biggest questions I get is, okay, I understand plant products are covered, right? What is not covered by the declaration? So pallets, I don't think this will probably apply to anyone here, but I'm going to go through it just in case it does. So if you have pallets that are being used for dunnage, so essentially if you're shipping in products, they're on a pallet, and they're just being used to move other merchandise, they do not require a declaration. If you're bringing in a container of pallets to sell, they would. That goes for all packing material. I gave a presentation to some of the spirits folks, and they were explaining how, they would package wine or other spirits in like wooden crates or use cardboard or other wood products to sort of pack. That does not require a declaration. If it's being used to package something that's being brought in to sell commercially, don't need a declaration for it. It's only if you're bringing something in as merchandise. The other thing, and again, I don't think this applies to anyone here, but it's worth noting, is common cultivars. So these are things that are grown as commodities. APHIS has a guidance document on their website. So if you want to know more about common cultivars, you can ask at the end, or just Google common cultivar APHIS guidance, and it will give you everything you need to know, sort of a little searchable sheet, so that you can, put in whatever species you're trading in and check and make sure if it's a common cultivar and therefore not covered by the declaration. And I know this is of interest for this group because I've worked with some of the music industry folks on CITES. So if you are trading in a product that is listed on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that is not an exclusion to Lacey. Just because you have CITES paperwork, which you absolutely should if it's a CITES listed species, that does not give you an automatic pass through the Lacey Act. So bamboo, again, not sure if this applies to y'all. Want to run through it real quickly in case it does. APHIS also has guidance for bamboo. Essentially, if you have cultivated bamboo, basically it's being raised to be traded commercially, you're growing a big field, then that's not covered by the declaration. It is covered by the declaration if it's wild bamboo, if you don't know what type of bamboo, or if it's mixture of cultivated and wild. Just Google APHIS bamboo guidance, and it will give you everything you need to know. De minimis. This is actually something I've been talking about with the government and have asked them to put out some additional guidance on, because I think it's been a point of confusion for people that are trading in products that either have just a little bit of wood in them or the product itself is very small, because they think of de minimis a little differently than the US government does when it comes to the Lacey Act. So APHIS has yet again another set of guidance. But the way to think about this is two conditions have to be met, right? So you have no more than 5% of the total weight of the individual product. So the example I always give is if you have a shirt with wooden buttons, right? Less than 5% of the weight is going to be wooden. But it also depends on how much you're bringing in per shipment, right? Per import line on the declaration. So if you're bringing in one shirt with wooden buttons, it is less than 5% of the total weight, and it doesn't exceed 2.9 kilograms, you would be able to import that singular shirt, and it would be under the de minimis. If you are bringing in a pallet of shirts with wooden buttons, that might be under 5% overall, but it is going to be exceeding the 2.9 kilogram limit that APHIS has set. So therefore it would not apply. I don't think that the de minimis exemption would apply for anyone here, simply because it's obviously going to be more than 5% of the total weight for anything you're dealing in. But just want to put it out there in case it is. Where the confusion, I think, comes in is because APHIS defines de minimis very different than CBP does. CBP looks at it based on the shipment's value, a percentage of the value versus percentage of the weight. So again, if you want more information on this, you can look at the guidance or talk to your customs broker. So now that we've gotten through some of the bits about exemptions and the like, let's talk a little bit about the declaration itself. So I've mentioned already that it has a phased-in approach. The Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, is under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. APHIS is the agency that has been tasked with dealing with the declaration aspect of the Lacey Act. And they made the decision to slowly phase in who is covered by the declaration. Now, the reason that they have given me a grant, the reason I'm here today, the reason all of you guys joined today is because we are now in phase 7. This was published in the Federal Register notice, I want to say it was May of this year, and it has an implementation deadline of December 1st. The comment period has already closed, so it's too late to put in comments, but what you really need to know is that if you are covered by HTS code on any item phases 1 through 7, well, phases 1 through 6, you're already filing a declaration. Phase 1 through 7, that 7th phase, you would have to start filing the declaration as of December 1st. I don't know how many of you on this call are importers of record. If you are, then you really need to pay attention if you're in that 7th phase to that December 1 deadline, because it is required as of that point. So this notice that APHIS has put out for phase 7 is intended to cover everything but composite wood products. And APHIS lists examples of what they view composite wood products to be. So that's going to be things like paper, paperboard, particle, MDF, HDF. That will all be covered in a later phase. What's important to note about this is that APHIS has said our intention is to cover everything but composites. However, each of these phases has come with a list of HTS codes. So it is possible that there might be a product out there that is not listed in one of these HTS codes, but is also not 100% composite material. APHIS has reserved the right, I think they actually might have to do this, of putting out a future Federal Register notice to cover a couple additional HTS codes to sort of meet this umbrella approach that they're trying to do. Again, it's important to note, whether you are filing a declaration or not, whether you're covered in any of the current phases by HTS code, if it is a plant implant product, you are still bound by the Lacey Act. This is simply dealing with the declaration aspect of it. So I've kind of walked through this a little bit, but again, if it is not listed in phases 1 through 7, if it is not composite material, and if it does not qualify for a de minimis exemption, then you don't currently have to file a declaration. But again, this could change, and these products are still covered by Lacey. So let's talk a little bit about the PPQ 505. There's kind of 2 main categories. You have the basic business information about the shipment, and then you've got something that's going to be specific to the product that you're bringing in. So the basic business information should be pretty easy to fill out at this point. I certainly hope anyway, because it's information that you should already have. Things like the HTS code, who it's going to, who it's coming from, what is the container, right? Very general information. Where people can get a little tripped up comes on the next section, specifically the area I have bolded, the species and genus. You have a lot of folks that don't always know the scientific names for the product that they're bringing in. They might be thinking of it in terms of a trade name, in terms of an industry shorthand, right? In terms of how that company thinks of that product internally. It's really important that you put these scientific names. If you do not have a scientific name, that is flagged for APHIS to take a closer look at the declaration. So please, talk to other people in the industry, talk to your trade associations, do some Googling. You really do have to have that scientific name. You also need to have the country of harvest. I was on a call earlier today with APHIS, and they said one of the biggest red flags for them is when people put what they consider the country of origin, and it doesn't match up, right? The country of harvest, the example they gave was someone that submitted a declaration for a tropical wood, and they listed the country of harvest as Canada. Canada does not grow tropical wood. And so that was an automatic red flag for APHIS. So it's really important that you look at the definitions of what APHIS is looking for. They also are looking at the quantity of the material in metric and the value of the product, not of the component. If you have questions on how to fill out a declaration, APHIS is more than happy to help you because they would much rather have that discussion in advance versus having to flag a declaration for being filled out incorrectly. So this is a paper copy that I've screenshotted essentially of the PPQ 505. It is important to note that the paper option is only available in very specific circumstances and is actually in the process of going away. Declarations are filed electronically, so you can file them two ways. Customs broker can file them in the ACE system, or APHIS has their own online system called LAWGS, LAWGS, because they love a fun acronym. But those in short order are going to be the only ways to file a PPQ 505. So we've talked a little bit about Lacey and how it's a strict liability law. I think what's most frustrating for business people is that this law does not specify what you have to do to comply, right? We're all really used to laws that are very prescriptive. It will be, if you do these 4 things, then you have complied. If you fill out this piece of paperwork, you've complied. If you ask these 12 questions, you've complied. Lacey is unfortunately not like that. There is no definition of what due care is required to confirm that your supply chain is free of illegality. It's not specified anywhere. So you're probably asking, well, Ashley, how can you provide education if the government has not defined it? We look at the enforcement actions. We're getting ready in just a moment to walk through some of the big enforcement actions. It's important to take these with a grain of salt, right? Because if you break the law and the US government comes after you and you have settlement in a court of law, well, that's intended to be punitive, right? That company has done something wrong, and so they have to be punished. But if you can look at multiple enforcement cases, you start to see common threads of what the US government is looking for, right? What are the standards that they're holding these companies to that the company did not meet? And so we've been able, as an industry, to look at all of these settlements. You're welcome to Google them yourself if you need some bedtime reading. And you can see what those standards are that the US government is looking for. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement. This is what violations will cost you. I want to emphasize off the bat, these are a floor. These are not a ceiling. We're going to walk through some of the big enforcement cases in the slide after this. You will see nobody gets $10,000 as a fine. It is significantly exponentially above that. So please don't look at this and think that this is the maximum. This is the minimum. The other thing that I want to call your attention to is over in the penalty column here. If you look at the last bullet in every single one of these boxes, you'll see forfeiture of goods. Under the Lacey Act, if you violate it, you do not get to keep the product. Period. End of discussion. There is no way for a manufacturer or an importer or a business to keep a product that has been deemed illegal under the Lacey Act. 9 times out of 10, the products are destroyed. I know of one particular case where they actually was being held at a port, determined to have violated the Lacey Act. They literally pulled all the material out. I want to say it was either flooring or plywood, and they drove like construction equipment over it back and forth until it was splintered and trash, and they were able to get rid of it. In a very few cases, the US government has made the decision to donate the product to Habitat for Humanity, cabinets and the like. But that still does not enter the stream of commerce, right? So if you violate the Lacey Act, you lose the product. That's it. The last thing that I want to note here is if you look under the first row, civil, right? The lowest penalty that you can get, it means you do not have to know or even have been able to know that the product was illegal, and you can still be found to have violated the Lacey Act. And this is particularly important when it comes to small businesses, and I know many of you are, right? You don't have a compliance department. You don't have a bunch of lawyers on staff to be able to do some of this research for you. So it is unfortunate, but you will still be held to the same standards as someone that has a big company. So let's talk a little bit about some of these enforcement cases. Before I get to them, I do want to note, we're going to go through, I think it's 6 of them, 6 or 7. These are simply the really big ones that made a splash, right? That were in court, there's news articles. There are dozens, if not multiples of dozens of other cases that never made it to court, right? The company said, okay, we'll pay the fines. We're not going to fight this. You can destroy the product. So please don't think that these are the only enforcement actions. I am also aware of at least 2 more that are currently pending, both with small businesses, unfortunately. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. So the biggest case, and the case that I think most people are probably familiar with, particularly in your industry, is going to be Gibson Guitar. This was the first enforcement action under the Lacey Act for plant and plant products. And it was back in 2012. And those of you that were in the industry at the time will probably remember it made national news. There were all of these pictures and videos of, armed agents going into the Gibson factory and, people being perp walk in the parking lot and computers being pulled out. It was a really big deal, a really big press deal. Now, it was the first case. So quite frankly, I think the government went a little easier on Gibson than they might have if that case was today. They had a 5-page compliance plan, a deferred prosecution agreement, and their penalties were pretty low. It's only $350,000 and then community service. What is very interesting to me about the Gibson Guitar case is Gibson Guitar was not the importer of record. It was their 1 or 2 person shop called Luthiers International. They were the importer of record. But we don't call it the Luthiers International case, right? We call it the Gibson Guitar case because the Department of Justice went through the supply chain, right? They're catching everyone they can along the way, and they're going to take it down as far as possible. So even if you are a couple steps removed from the importer of record, know that they can still take a prosecution far down the supply chain. The next case I want to talk about is J&L Tonewoods. So this is 2015. What is particularly fascinating about this case is this was not imported wood. If you remember back to that history slide I gave you, and I talked about how the Lacey Act was intended to deal with interstate commerce, it's exactly what this case is about. You had US citizens here in the United States that were illegally harvesting wood, I think it was from a national forest maybe, and selling it across state lines. And so because that state line was crossed, they were able to be prosecuted under the Lacey Act. So if you're thinking, hey, I don't use a ton of imported wood or I'm a mix, right? You can still be liable for Lacey Act violations here in the United States if it's crossing state lines. It was a very small company. It was family owned. So multiple people got time in prison. There was probation, 159,000 and change in restitution. Because it was such a small business, they ultimately went out of business because most of their people were in jail and they had a significant fine. So that is J&L Tonewoods. The next case we go to is Lumber Liquidators. That's 2016. I want to draw your attention to the fourth bullet point, the last one in black. This is the first time we see, as part of the settlement agreement, a government supervised business, right? So essentially the government said to lumber liquidators, we can't trust you to do this right. So we're going to supervise your business for the next 5 years, which is quite a long time to have the government looking over your shoulder and into your spreadsheets. The other thing that I want to mention is if you look down to the $13 million in penalties and payments. Now, I mentioned earlier that a company cannot keep product that is found to be, illegal under the Lacey Act. What's fascinating about lumber liquidators is lumber liquidators paid extra on top of their fines, right? So that consumers could keep their product, because they didn't want the brand damage of the US government going into a consumer's home and saying, hey, Ashley, the flooring that you have was actually harvested illegally under the Lacey Act, so we got to rip it out, and too bad for you, right? So the company did not get to keep the product, but the consumers did, but the company had to pay for that privilege. So that's the only time I'm aware of the product remaining sort of in the supply chain. But again, it's not with the company, it's just already sold to the consumer. So 2017, you have Young Living, which is a essential oils company. And again, government supervised business for 5 years, and they have a 22-page plan. What's particularly interesting about the Young Living case, they self-reported to the government. They came to the US government and said, hey, in looking at our practices, we recognize we've been doing some things incorrectly, illegally, and we want to essentially self-whistleblow to the government and work with you all to fix this. And when I share that, I think a lot of people look at the $760,000 in penalties and payments and say, wow, $750,000, and they self-reported? That doesn't seem fair. My response to that is, if that's how much it is when you self-report, imagine what the penalties would have been if they'd been found out by the government on their own. If you think back to the last slide, lumber liquidators paid $13 million. $750,000 seems like a deal in comparison. Now, there have been 2 cases so far this year. The first is the Quintanas. I have their name down because they actually were trading under 6 or 7 different trade names. So it's easier to just call their last name by the case. They were found to have sold somewhere between $25 and $65 million of plywood products, violating Lacey Act and other customs laws. It is such a wide range because that's the Department of Justice range. That's the best guess the DOJ has for how much they brought into the country. Each member of the couple got 57 months in prison. They each have 3 years of supervised release afterward. Both of them are prohibited from ever engaging in business in Lacey Act products, not to mention the $42.4 million in forfeitures and $1.6 million in storage costs. So you can see the Department of Justice is slowly but surely stepping up these penalties, right? The most recent one was about a month and a half ago. This was a company out in West Coast, I want to say either Tacoma or Seattle. And they were declaring wooden cabinets as being harvested from Malaysia rather than noting that they came from China. They were essentially attempting to sidestep tariffs. They owed $800,000 in duties. They had a $250,000 customs penalty. On top of $110,000 Lacey fine. They forfeited the containers, and now they have a 3-year supervision. And this is the first time that that we see this in a settlement. They're required to implement an environmental compliance plan under the auspices of the government. So the government is essentially going to be requiring them to do this, a third-party auditor essentially, and keeping an eye on whether they do it. So this has been 6 really big cases, right? And you probably noticed the first 4 were a few years apart, but now we have 2 in 1 year. And I mentioned earlier, I'm aware of at least a couple other pending cases. The Biden administration has made natural resource crime a priority. Department of Justice, Homeland Security, APHIS, all of these agencies are getting additional funding to go after criminals. I know that Homeland Security has actually hired 2 analysts from the FBI to take a closer look at the declaration data, particularly with phase 7 coming online. They anticipate a lot more, but they are really combing through, looking for people that are breaking the law, looking for people that don't know what they're doing, and they want to catch them. So I fully anticipate that I will be adding additional slides on enforcement cases as we go through the next year or so. So now that I've scared you with all these fines, what does compliance actually mean practically for you? I know all of you are here because you want to follow the law. You want to do things right. You want to comply, and you know it's an ethical way to do business. And I also know that nobody generally joins trade associations because they want to skirt legality. So that means that you have to exercise due care. You have to know your supply chain. I know that many of you are 1 or 2 or 3 person shops, right? You're very small. That does not mean that you are exempted from the Lacey Act. You have to have an internal compliance plan that you're creating, that you're following, and that you're continuously improving. One of the interesting things about the lumber liquidators case is when the Department of Justice came knocking at their door and said, hey, we have some concerns about some of your shipments. What does compliance look like for you? Lumber liquidators did the equivalent of pulling off the shelf a beautiful compliance plan. It was thorough. It included all the things they were supposed to be doing. They weren't doing it. The Department of Justice has been very clear that not only do you have to have a compliance plan, internal policies, right, but that you have to show that you are following it. So when it comes to due care, if you are an importer of record, you have to file the PPQ 505 and you have to conduct due care throughout your supply chain. Everyone in the supply chain, no matter where you are, has to know your source, your species, and your supplier. Not only is this a way to comply, but quite frankly, it's going to help limit you when it comes to possible enforcement actions. The Department of Justice has been public in saying that if they come to your door, right, and they say, hey, we have concerns about a shipment or shipments, if you can demonstrate the due care that you are doing, they will weigh that, right? They will consider that when they're assigning whether they prosecute you, whether there are penalties, if the penalties are high or low or somewhere in the middle. So showing that you have done due care, that you've looked into your supply chain, that you've questioned your suppliers, that is going to help you in the long term if, God forbid, something ever illegal does sneak into your supply chain. So what does it mean, right? There are 3 actions you need to be considered, or that you need to be prepared to take when it comes to your supply chain. You have to evaluate, mitigate, justify. So there's an example I always give, right? Let's say that you have wood that's coming in from a country, and you know that one region of the country, because you've seen the news, right? There's civil unrest, there's child labor, there's violence, right? It is a bad region where bad things are going on, laws are being broken. You would need to evaluate your supply chain, right? Where is my product coming from? Okay, well, let's say maybe that's in the north. My product is coming from the south, right? This particular wood, I know it's coming from there. Well, now you need to mitigate that risk, right? You have to find a way to reduce it. So maybe it is having more in-depth supplier questionnaires to confirm the geographic location, to talk to them about their policies around child labor, or ensuring there isn't any forced labor in their factories. If you have the ability, it's doing visits with them. Maybe it's at a trade show where you meet with them. Maybe you go visit them, but there's some sort of conversation that is regular where you're confirming these are my policies, these are the laws, I want to make sure you're following them, and what you're sending me is legal. And then you have to justify it. And by justify it, not only feel good internally, but document it. Because what you don't want to happen is the Department of Justice comes to your door and says, hey, I have questions about a shipment from 2019. And you say, ooh, I know I did some stuff then, oh, my cousin was helping me then. And like, I know he worked through it and I just don't remember, but I know it was fine at the time, right? That's not good. You want to be able to pull out paperwork and say, hey, here were the concerns that we outlined. Here's how I felt comfortable mitigating. And here's why I decided to continue trading in this species from this region with this person, whatever it is. You have to document all of the actions that you're taking. And again, those three risk areas: source, species, supplier. This is just a starting thought for you to think about. There could be other risks that aren't included here. You know your business better than I do. You'd be able to be more specific, but this can be a good starting point, right? Where is it coming from? Whether that's the country, the region, the county, the specific forest unit, whatever it is that a risk? Then you've got to think about the species, right? If you're trading, and many of you are, in high value wood, the higher the value, the more interesting it's going to be to criminals. So the species itself could be a risk factor. And then of course, your supplier or your supply chain, right? What are they doing? What are they offering you as evidence? Particularly if you are only buying in very small amounts, it might be really hard to get that information out of your suppliers or to be able to reach back into your supply chain. That is not an excuse under Lacey. You still have to make those efforts, and you still have to feel confident at the end of the day that you are doing legal trade. So how do you start? Because I know there's probably some folks on this call, because every time I do this, there are some folks on a call that are like, oh my goodness, I have to build a compliance program. How do I even start that, right? I know it sounds silly. Put it in writing that you want to trade in only legally harvested wood. Put it in your purchasing agreements, put it in your contracts, put it in everything. Get a written commitment from your suppliers saying, yes, I am complying with all applicable laws when I am selling this product to you. You have to identify the species, right? You have to ask questions about where it was harvested and what suppliers are doing. And I don't mean going to a supplier and saying, hey, Lynn, you're following all the rules, right? That's not really asking them, but saying, hey, Lynn, what are you doing to ensure compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, right? An open-ended question. You want them to come to you with what they're doing. You can consider tracking and traceability, right? How are you tracing your product through the supply chain? If you have a critical supply chain supplier or suppliers, you may want more information from them. You want to be aware of scientific tools. Wood ID is growing in leaps and bounds. It is not a silver bullet, right? You can't test it and be like, all right, I'm done with due diligence. I don't have to worry. But be aware, because science is coming along much faster than I think many people in the industry thought it would. So it can be a valuable tool. And then you want to think about what third parties can help you. Your trade association, right? There are lawyers, there are auditors, there are universities. You want to be aware of environmental groups. What are the environmental groups putting reports out on, right? You want to document, always document your research and actions. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say, keep an eye on our training. We are currently offering all of our training for free. There is no hidden cost. You don't have to put in a credit card, nothing. Under this grant, if you're interested, and there'll be a QR code at the end, we do on-demand online training. We have interactive webinars, and then you unfortunately have missed our in-person training that was free, but all of our online stuff is free right now. So the big question I always get at the end of this presentation, okay, Ashley, you've told me all about it. I'm terrified. How do I prove that I'm Lacey Act compliant? And the bad news is, getting back to that idea, right? There is no one single way, because Lacey Act is not prescriptive about what you have to do. There is no single way to prove that you're compliant. It is not a one size fits all. It is not a checklist. It is evaluating and mitigating your risk. And sometimes it's making the hard call not to trade. If you're working with a supplier and they can't or won't give you the information you need to feel comfortable, then sometimes you have to say no. So last but not least, this is a very simplified supply chain, right? I know many supply chains are far more convoluted than this. This, I think, is a good, simple example. If that concession owner at the top of that chain is doing something knowingly or unknowingly that is illegal, right? They're not paying their taxes, they're using child labor, they're getting something from a sketchy source, whatever it is, if it is illegal there, it becomes illegal through the rest of the chain. And the thing to remember is that the Department of Justice, they could technically try to go after someone in another country. It is far more likely that they're going to focus on the second half of that supply chain from the US importer of record on. So if you are in anywhere in this chain, you need to be aware. But from a liability perspective, you have a higher liability if you're here in the United States. So with that, I'm going to my screen appears to have frozen. There we go. So this is the QR code that I have. If anyone wants to take our education, it is free for the duration of the grant or until the funding runs out. So the next couple months. And I will open it up for any questions that you all have.
Brianna, do we have any questions in the chat?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, people were busy listening. This is very, very serious business, and for some of us in this business of violin or bow making, it's the first time that we're thinking about this. We're not Home Depot, we're not big companies like that. So it's really the first time that we're beginning to realize that we are an important part, we play an important role in seeing how woods are used in our industry and making sure that we are compliant in every aspect. For those of you that are in Europe, who have joined us from Europe, the EU regulations that are about to come into order soon are even stricter than what has always been the strictest out there. The Lacey Act is the strictest until now. And it is really not just using the wood, but how we use the wood that is so important to all of us. And that's what the Alliance has been working hard at for all of these years. Are there any questions? Yes, Chris.
Great presentation, Ashley. Thank you so much for being available.
Problem.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I forgot to hook up my microphone, so my laptop microphone's picking me up. So essentially, as far as documenting what we have in as an individual maker, what we have in our wood stores, what I hear you saying is that there isn't any easy way to sit down and just say, okay, I'm going to document, I have this many pieces of wood and write it all out. That doesn't sound like it's going to be adequate.
No. And it's important to remember, because I know that many of you will have a stockpile, right, that might be years old in some cases. The Lacey Act has covered you since 2008. So if you have wood in your pile, essentially, that's pre-2008, and you can document that, then that's probably something that once you've documented it's pre-2008, you can kind of set it aside, right? But if it's anything from the passage of the law on, then you could be required to show that that was not illegally harvested, which I understand can be very hard, right? Because that's going back too many years now, 15, 16 years. But you still have that liability under the law for anything from 2008 on.
So that leads me to another question. If we would be purchasing material from another colleague who got that material prior to 2008, are we then required to ask the colleague to support documentation as to when that material was purchased so that then we can document that it was purchased prior to 2008? Or is that something not to be worried about?
No, I would say any wood that you're purchasing, you need to be able to document everything about it, right? So if it's pre-2008, like if I'm buying from Lynn, I would say, hey, Lynn, like I'm going to need some paperwork that proves that this is pre-2008. So maybe it's purchase orders, maybe it's import records, right? Whatever it is, I want something that goes along with that purchase that tells me per my internal compliance policies, right? So this is pre-2008. If it is from the passage of the law after, then I would be asking Lynn personally, if this were me, I would be asking Lynn a lot more questions, right? Where did you get this from? Who was the supplier? Like what compliance programs did you and they and everyone in the supply chain have in place so that I know when I'm purchasing this from you, I'm not purchasing something that was illegally sourced?
And it's also important, I think, for us to remember that part about needing to have the species and genus and also the country of harvest. So if you're buying fingerboards that are coming from Europe, or you have 10 years ago, it's important to know those species. I think that will be particularly challenging with ebony. We don't know, for many cases, what the country of harvest might be. Not the countries, not Germany selling it to us, but the country of harvest. Could be Cameroon, it could be India, it could be any number of places. So there's documentation that's required. And that's why the declarations that the Alliance has put together over the last year worked with CITES representatives, worked with members, violin and bowmaker members from all over the world to try to make some kind of uniform documentation that provides species information if you need that, and just is trying to make everything more transparent.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned the EUDR, because that is, I think, going to be add an interesting wrinkle, right? Because the Lacey Act says that you can't source anything in contravention of any law in any country it passes through, right? Which means that anything coming from Europe, whether it's processed, it's coming from there originally, is going to have to comply with the EUDR to be imported into the US and be considered legal under Lacey. So that geolocation, all of that compliance, right, that comes with the EUDR, it applies internally to the EU as well. So, you know, I'm sure you guys are just as aware as I am about all of the problems, shall we say, that the EUDR rollout is facing, and how some places may struggle to provide some of that information immediately after the implementation deadline. So that's just something to be aware that you're going to have to comply with the EUDR in order to be importing something from Europe, or excuse me, exporting from Europe, importing into the US.
Any other questions?
Andrew has a question in the
Okay.
chat. Are you able to see that?
Here, let me look. Okay, wood purchased before 1900. Okay, so again, if it's pre-2008, you're going to need to be able to document that it's pre-2008. That is how it is. There is no formal, and I'll be very clear here, there is no formal documentation. It's not like CITES where you can have a pre-convention right form where you can note, hey, CITES is officially recognized, or Fish and Wildlife in the US is officially recognized. This is pre-convention listing. There is no form like that for the Lacey Act, but you need to be internally confident that this product was, or this wood, whatever it is purchased before 2008, and I can prove that. So it doesn't matter how far back you're going, right? It can be obviously antique. Same thing with CITES, right? You've got to have some paper trail, some documentation. You have to be confident and be able to show that confidence in some way that it's pre-2008. And then, oh, hold on, sorry, someone else added. How do we identify the different types? So that would be a question that you need to talk to APHIS about. If you have questions on how to fill out a declaration form in terms of like what the scientific species is, you can talk to them. They might be able to guide you towards some resources, but ultimately that responsibility is on you to be able to identify the scientific name, because they're not going to be able to do that for you. And, you know, I talked a little bit about wood testing. Sometimes wood testing can be helpful. It depends on the database, you know, it depends on the sample size they have, on the samples in general that they have. But that is unfortunately really going to be on the individual to determine. I wish that I could give you an easy answer on that.
Great. I'm told Peter Beer has a question. Peter, can you unmute and hit us with it?
Yeah, sorry, Ashley, sorry, rookie question. Does anything made of wood coming into the US need a Lacey Act? So if we bringing in an antique violin to the US for sale, does it need a Lacey Act declaration?
So because it's going to be, I'm just going to think through this really quickly because this is the first time I've gotten a question on antiques. So if it's being imported into the US and you're going to have to like fill out a customs form and it's plant product, then I believe it would. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to email APHIS and I will get an answer back and send it to Lynn and she can share that to be definitive. But I'm almost positive it would. If it is from a declaration perspective, if it's covered under one of the HTS codes. If it is not covered under one of the HTS codes, doesn't matter if it's antique, brand new, whatever, it does not require a declaration. But let me ask and find out for sure. If it's
Okay.
an antique version of an HTS code, my inclination is to say yes.
So I'm not quite sure what an HTS code is or how I would find out what one was that I was to put on a form.
Sure. So HTS is the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. And so it is when you're importing anything into the US, it's a code that is used. So it'll be a couple numbers, right? And it will match to a product category. So like you might put in the code for flooring, right? And so it's an easier way when you're importing things to be able to specify what category something belongs to. So APHIS, as they've put out these phases and declarations, rather than just saying a name, right? Like all flooring, all bows, they have done it by specific HTS code. So that's simply a way of categorizing and classifying what is being brought in.
Okay.
Peter, I do know that there's a different HTS code for finished violins and for finished bows.
Right. Okay. And but this is primarily about post 2008 new goods for sale. Is that right? Or
So it's any plant product harvested, transported, traded, bought, manufactured, whatever, right? If it is from that implementation deadline on, then it is covered by the Lacey Act. It's not just a manufactured good, right? So if you had, a tree that you cut down in 2009, that's going to be covered by the Lacey Act, even if it's just now being manufactured.
so if 2008 is a critical date, then presumably an antique is exempt.
Well, but it depends on when you're importing it, right? So like, let's say the antique violin is in Europe right now, and it's being brought into the United States today. It's being imported. The date of import is going to be today. So you're going to have to document, you're going to have to be able to document information about it to be able to import it.
So the chances of me knowing exactly where Antonio Stradivari bought his wood in 1702, it's really difficult to find that information out.
Yes.
Do they
Yes.
take a sort of fairly prosaic view on this?
I'm sorry.
Do they take a fairly good overall view on this, or?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard DOJ talk about how they're trying to catch criminals, right? They're trying to catch the bad people that are knowingly breaking laws. They're not trying to catch someone that's bringing in an 1800s viola, right? Like that's not an enforcement priority for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
They are going to want you to make best effort, right? And something that's obviously antique, it's a very old violin, being able to say like, hey, I'm aware that this is this wood and it is antique and here's some documentation. Again, you don't need to submit that documentation to the federal government if you've got a paper trail, right? It was sold at auction or it was in private collectors, whatever that looks like. As long as you have it and you keep it and you think, okay, this is clear and obvious that this is an antique and it was harvested and this is the information I need about it, that's all you need. It's not one of those things where you're going to have to submit a packet of information the day that you import it.
Okay, thank you.
And again, it's going to be a little different if you're bringing it in personally, like if you're taking it on the plane with you or something, right? We're talking import of record.
Right.
And I know there was a question on bamboo in the chat, so I can answer that pretty easily. So if it's not from a wild harvest, do we still need to document it? Can we say cultivated? Yeah, so declaration is only for wild, unknown, or mixed, right? If it is cultivated, you do not need a declaration if it's essentially what you're asking. But if it's wild, unknown, or mixed, then you do need a declaration. And they have a whole guidance document on which codes you put in and that sort of thing. I'm happy to, and the links in this are live, Lynn, so feel free to pull those out and send those to anyone that wants them if you want.
Thank you.
Or again, you can Google like guidance APHIS and then the keywords. Okay, another question on HTS code. Yes, it is important to verify. We had a question on whether it's important to verify that your HTS code is up to date. Absolutely correct. If you are uncertain about an HTS code, you think, hey, my product could fit in this one or this one, you can ask for something called a binding ruling, which is essentially sending in a bunch of information about your product and asking the US government to tell you which code it is. They have a whole database of binding rulings that you can also look at. If that's something you're interested in, please feel free to just shoot me an email because it's probably more convoluted than we want to get into here, but I can send you direct links. I can connect you with the person that does wood binding rulings. She's someone that we, for very many reasons, have a good relationship with and do webinars with. So I'm happy to connect you directly if you want more information on the HTS code side of things. And then what about exporting a new bow to Europe? So that's going to be covered under the EU regulations, currently EU TR, soon, depending on where you are in the process, EU DR. So it sounds like, Lynn, you guys maybe have talked with membership about that, but I know EU has said for a while they're going to be bringing out a new FAQ. I've been told in the next week or so we should see that. With some more questions, so they will have more information. But yeah, if it's coming from the US or from anywhere and it's going into the EU, then you're going to need to be complying with the EU DR. Lacey is only for products coming into the United States.
Any information that you receive, Ashley, that you could share with us, I can then forward to everyone. That would be important information for us to have.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to be in Europe in a couple weeks, and I'm going to be meeting with some of the EU folks. So if I get any up-to-date information, I will happily pass that along. I know everybody really wants it to just be delayed. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. So probably not good news, but I can at least give you any news I get.
There was an additional question from Andrew Dipper about old ebony fingerboards being reused into veneers.
Again, the Lacey Act is really depending on you to document internally. If you are reusing material, right, and it's internal, right, I'm buying it from Lynn or from Peter or Daniel or whoever, right, I just need to be able to document to my confidence level that this is something that I feel confident that was legally sourced, right? So again, there's not going to be a form, and trust me, we have asked since 2008 for guidance, for a form, for a checklist, for literally anything, and they don't want to give up that prosecutorial discretion. So you can ask for it, it's not going to happen, right? It is simply being able to document to your internal confidence level that what you are doing is correct, which again, I know is not a way that business people normally approach things. So it is very frustrating.
I think that looks like the end of the questions. Did you have another one, Chris?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
And that is from an individual maker's perspective, does the use of, like a bridge, a cello bridge, cello fingerboard, cello, I mean, all of the parts that go into the instrument, to an individual instrument, do those parts qualify as the de minimis?
No, unfortunately. So de minimis is really only going to be when a tiny, tiny part of an overall product is made of wood. So it has to be that less than 5% and less than 2.9%. or excuse me, 2.9 kilograms. I apologize. So less than 5% of the overall product can't weigh more than 2.9 kilograms. So, I mean, if you have a giant, essentially a giant plastic, I don't know, basket, right? And it's got a tiny wooden knob on it. Like that is really what the de minimis is intended to cover, is where it is a very minuscule amount of wood in comparison to a larger product, and it weighs a very little amount. So, you know, if you're importing, I'm not a musician, so give me some grace here, but like a fretboard, right? Like, yes, it may weigh less than 2.9 kilograms, perhaps, but it's not going to be less than 5% of the product, right? Because that is the product. It's 100% wood when you think about it that way. Or if you're thinking of a guitar, right? Well, each individual item may be less than 2.9 kilograms, but the whole thing is wood. So the de minimis is not intended as a way to get small parts in. It's really for overall large products that have just a tiny, tiny little bit of wood on it. Again, getting back to that idea, a shirt with a couple wooden buttons, right?
I think that's the end of our questions. I did want to thank you so much, Ashley, for coming
No
and
problem.
presenting such an important issue for us. And thanks to all of you who attended as well. We will be doing more of these talks. They're so important for everybody in our business. We are in phase 7 of this Lacey Act rollout, which is the first time that includes finished instruments and bows. And we're an industry that is very low in volume. So it would be easy to say, oh, no, that they're not talking about me. But we're high in value. And I think our common goal needs to be keeping these instruments safe. And in order to do that, we really need to be thinking about adequate documentation. So in our next session, building on today's presentation, and now knowing that every person down the entire supply chain is responsible for compliance with the Lacey Act, we're going to start to discuss how you, distributors, shop owners, makers, can provide your customers with what they need for documentation. Because remember, we travel around the world with our stuff, but musicians travel around also, and they're going to need full documentation on the natural resources used in the creation of their instruments or bows. So that's the next step, I think, once we realize that, oh, we can't opt out of this. We can't, as long as we're using wood products, as long as we're importing them, as long as we're importing instruments and bows, we must be working towards compliance with the Lacey Act. So Ashley, thank you so much for your help with that. And we'll get back to you as soon as we've set a date for the next talk. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.